Hello and welcome to chapter 30 of this class where we're going to be going through a comic page. Initially, my plan was to include that panel that we worked on in the comic page itself. So, we'd work up to create a comic page with the panel. If you're choosing to go for a vertical placement, it's a bit easier to include something like this. If you're not, it may be a little bit tricky to actually include the panel you've got into a new page layout. If you manage to do it, great, you've got half the work done. What I am going to do is just have the panel as reference, and then I'm going to think about the kind of small piece of a scene that I want to portray with the panel in mind. So it's kind of like related to it, and then I'll just use the panel as my color reference, for instance, and just my environment reference as well. Now, as I mentioned before, my actual process for creating a comic page doesn't really involve a lot of pre planning. So, usually, when I have a chapter to work on, which is around 30 pages or two or three sort of long ish scenes, I will have an outline for each chapter. And I'll talk about that more when I get to the planning stage of this class. But based on that outline, I will then kind of jump straight in and start making pages one by one, or at least thumbnailing them and kind of sketching them out one by one. Occasionally, I will go back and fix certain things. The dialogue generally changes a little bit from the moment that I sketch it out first to the moment that I actually go in and letter it. But it's very, I would say, unplanned. It's a little bit of a chaotic process to at least plan comic pages, and my outlines generally only have a couple of lines of description, so it's not like it's describing every single thing that happens. This works because I work mostly on my own, so at least anything from the planning stage to the sort of line art stage, I kind of am in full control over, and the notes that I make mentally are sort of for myself and not necessarily for an assistant. If you're working with more people, even if it's just one person who's actively contributing to your comic in some sense, you may need a more structured way to do this. You may need to transcribe some sort of scripts for someone else to read and understand what's going on. In my case, that's not necessarily the case. And so, what this means is that, let's say, and I'm not actually going to work on a page that's part of anything bigger necessarily, so it's a standalone sort of page, but I'm going to be looking at my reference picture, so the panel that I worked on and that we applied all the different sort of shading techniques to. And I'm going to think about a little scene that might play out. So I've got this character sitting on top of a tree and they're looking down at something, right? And potentially someone. And I already mentioned that I had another character that is kind of part of the same universe and they kind of interact. So what I'm going to do is, without any further context, I'm going to have this character sort of sit there looking at this second character, right, who's kind of unaware of her presence, and she's going to call out because I want to add some text so I can show you how the text part works in the next chapter. So, with this in mind, and this is usually how it goes in general as well, so I have a scene in mind. I've got the character looking at another character. I know sort of what the flow is going to be. They're going to call out, the other character is going to realize that they've been called out, look back, and then the character is going to say something, right? So, very simple sort of layout. I can already kind of see it play out. And what I'm going to do is, instead of actually using this panel, like I said, I'm going to just, based on that, start creating a thumbnail of sorts. To just give you a little bit of an overview of what my thumbnailing canvas looks like, and it's not just a thumbnailing canvas. I don't use that technique of creating a small thumbnail just to get a sense of the panels and then translating it to a bigger canvas. I do my thumbnails in the canvas of the size that I'm going to be working on, but that's also because I work on very small sizes. As like I mentioned before, for normal illustrations, sometimes I'll start at 800 pixels wide, and for comics, I start at 1,000 pixels wide, so it's also not that much bigger. Now, there are multiple ways, of course, to draw the same scene or sort of create this sort of different panels to fit the same sequence of actions. What I'm going to do for this one, or what I'm thinking about doing just before I kind of get down to it, is I'll have a first panel of sorts of like establishing that there's a character that's being watched by this character on the tree. All right, let me get the panel back on. And then in the middle part, I want the sort of calling out, where this character is going to say something like, "You're going the wrong way." I'm just kind of trying to come up with it on the fly. But let's say that she says, hey, you're going the wrong way. The character that's being watched is going to perceive that sound and then look back and then see this character. And then at the end, I want to like have a parallel shot of, instead of it being the perspective of this character that's watching the other one, we're going to have the perspective of the character that's being watched. So I'm going to make a little bit of a mirror sort of effect here, or at least that's what I'm planning to do. I may change my mind halfway through. And so how does this go? As you can see here, I've got my canvas. My canvas right now is at 1000 pixels by 1524 pixels. This isn't an arbitrary size, it's a size that I have a template for, and it fits the format that I printed in quite well. But again, like I said before, like your format is going to depend, or your template is going to depend on what you're actually working on. And I've got this layer here, you can see it on the top right, that usually I just have a base file saved as kind of my template, right? So I got a Clip Studio file that looks like this. It's got the grid activated to just show me the halfway point on both dimensions. And then it's got this one layer on multiply and like a sketch layer that has the sort of edges or the vertices of my kind of drawing area. So this is where I'm going to fit my panels. It is a very kind of, it's not a super technical way to create panels. I know Clip Studio has tools for sort of establishing guides for borders and things like that. Not just Clip Studio, but most software, like I think Photoshop has something like that as well, where you can actually just have in your document established what your bleed is going to be, and you can have a ruler. If you press Command R or Control R on Clip Studio, I think it's a default shortcut, but you will have a ruler show up that shows you dimensions, and you can just decide, you know, I want this amount of kind of inches or centimeters between the margins. I don't do that. I simply use this little layer here. Again, comics do not need to be super complicated. Things like this don't need to be scary for you to start with. You can't just establish your own borders and then work from there, generally speaking, as long as you're not working on some format that's completely whack. And if you're not doing anything super fancy with the pages that then will require extra work for printing, you don't have to worry too much about, you know, kind of being nitpicky about the format. You can, if you want. I'm not here to tell you how to, because I don't personally, I just work like this. And I'll lock this layer, so if I press this little lock symbol here, the layer is locked, which means, it just means I'm not going to change this layer, I can't touch it. I can hide it, but it's, if I try to move it around, you can see it just doesn't let me. And that prevents me from shifting this layer around, because it's just a guide, it doesn't need to be touched. And I'll create a new layer, and with my little buffer brush that I've been using for sketching at a fairly big size, I'm going to just hand draw some panels in. Now, because I've been doing this for a while and I have my own sort of style, it's easy for me to just go for it. I don't need to consider the whole canvas. Usually what I do is I think about what my first shot's going to be, or what my main shot is going to be. So in this case, I'm thinking my first shot is going to be a sort of wide shot, so it's going to be a whole row. And what I want is it's the perspective of the person that's on the tree. I'm going to place the person here in the foreground, right, on the tree, and then I'm going to place their quote-unquote victim in here. So it's a perspective shot. I've got the person that they're looking at, I've got my person here. It's going to look something like this, that's what I'm imagining. And I may have this be a very big close-up so you barely see any details. It's more like a shadow, so that we create a little bit of suspense. Actually, usually I will do this on a different layer. Let me separate the layers right now, because I may want to shift things around. I may want to change the panel size later on, so I'm just going to select the sketch I did. Not that it has a lot going on, but so I have a separate layer. And I tend to have a separate layer for the kind of panels, for the sketch, and for the text. So I can move things around and they're not super like interfering with each other. But this is just a thumbnail slash sketch, so it doesn't really matter all that much. So this is my character, this is the other character. I can create some like background details just so I can see what the perspective is doing here. Let's say they're walking down the path. One thing I won't be able to demonstrate is how to use sort of 3D here, because it's like a wooden sort of area, but even then you could kind of do something with the primitives or have a background saved and just apply it here. I'm gonna be very sort of simple and basic with this. So this would be roughly my first shot. And now that I have my first shot, I know I want to end with a similar shot. So one thing I could do is I just copy and paste the panel and I move it down because I want to parallel this shot. Let's say that's what I'm going to do. It's a little bit of guesswork here. There's no ideal solution for what I'm trying to get to here, but let's say this is what I've decided. Sometimes you just get to a panel and you decide one thing. You decide this is gonna have two mirrored panels, or this is gonna have one big central panel, and then you just work around it. So what I want for my mirrored panel would be the character that's being watched looking back at my character on the tree. Now, there's two directions I can take this in, right? I can have the character in the same position as this one, looking up, right? So they're kind of turned around or something and they're looking up. And then I got my little character on the tree here. So I would mirror the sort of position. Or I could mirror the position altogether. So I have the character on the tree still on the same side, and then I've got the character looking up here in the corner. Two of these options, they will both work, I think, visually speaking, because the characters aren't necessarily close to each other enough that you're like restrained or constrained by which angle each of them has, as long as you keep them in a sort of similar relative position. I will go with this one, I think, because composition wise it contrasts the first one better than if I made the sort of foreground character on the same side. So this is like my skeleton for the two parallel shots, and now I'm going to fill the middle. And because I have a parallel or a mirrored sort of composition, I'm going to try and go for mirrored composition in the middle as well, or something of the sort. Now, or at least something that's balanced in the middle. One thing that I can do here is create one big block in the middle, and then I would maybe separate it somewhere here, or I actually separate it on the middle, and then separate this one here because I want the realization of a character, right? So I'm going to do that thing where I do one panel right next to the other, and it's basically the same thing. It's just the character moving their head or realizing something, and that's what I'm going to have here. So I'm going to have my character, this character here, which I have a design for, so it's not going to be the character we've been working on necessarily, but it's kind of another character that I'm familiar with, and I'm going to have them sort of be distracted. Now, in this case, it makes more sense if here in the top panel I draw the character facing this direction, because then I want to draw them in the profile facing this direction, because if they're facing this direction and then I have another character here, it can kind of almost hint that they're looking at that character when they're in this position, and they're not. They have to be distracted. The sound has to almost come from the back, and so knowing that I want to have this sequence informs what I'm actually going to do here, which is have the character walk in this direction, right? And then for consistency, because they're walking in this direction, I am going to have them in the lower panel walk in this direction because it's kind of flipped around.